Today's headline is some hot balls. The subheadline says, a story of some brave boys and the renowned Commodore Perry. This article was written by Catherine B. Foote. It says, it was bright and fair that 30th day of May, 1814, in lovely Newport. Never more lovely than at that season, and in that long ago time when it was a quiet rural town, with its lanes and quiet roads, full of wild luxuriance of the leaf and blossoms of the early summer. A lot of boys were playing on the green about the old stone mill, when suddenly one stopped in the very act of throwing a ball to one of the others and said, "What's that?" And he turned his head quickly towards the beach road and lifted his hand with a gesture for silence. Every boy had stopped yelling, and a dead silence reigned for 2 seconds, when John Shaw, the boy who had first spoken, said, There, hear it? There's a ship gun. Come on, boys." And every one of them tore down the beach road as fast as their legs would carry them, and that was very fast. As they ran, others ran also, men and women, and presently a man on horseback galloped by them, and the men and boys shouted, "It's the Commodore! It's Perry! There's a fight!" And they gave a wild hurrah as well as they could, when they were using all the breath they had, and kept on running until they reached the turn, where the beach and harbor lay before them. Commodore Perry checked his horse a moment, and then galloped back the way he had come, shouting to someone, "I'm coming back." There were 2 vessels in sight. One was evidently in distress, and the other was evidently pursuing. "It's a British vessel. It's a brig. She's trying to capture the other one. What's her name? Where's she from? Is the one she's after one of our vessels?" "Hang the old redcoats," were a few of the exclamations. A dignified old gentleman just then drove up in his sulky, and took up a spyglass and got out, that he might use it to better advantage. It's let me see," he muttered, as the others crowded about. "I can't see the name quite distinctly, but she's a foreigner. Ha! She's gone ashore. That's a British brig beyond. I know by her looks. Confound her, they're lowering boats." Everyone ran to the beach, and it was then plain that the foreign vessel was ashore, and the boats from the other ship were pulling toward her. The vessels flew signals of distress, and the people on shore fairly howled with rage to see, as they thought, the vessel taken by the enemy before their very eyes, while they were helpless. But presently a great shout came from Perry, followed by a party of seamen, from the flotilla anchored on the other side of the island, and dragging a 6-rounder came hurrying down the beach. The wheel sank deep into the sand, but scores of hands grasped at the ropes, and strong and willing arms pushed and pulled, and presently the gun was in position, and Commodore Perry sighted and fired it. "Ha!" he exclaimed. That was near, as the smoke cleared, for the 2 boats set off from the British brig were evidently alarmed, and had stopped rowing. "We'll stop them yet, my boys," cried Perry, in his clear, ringing voice. "I can always trust my Newport boys." And the crowd cheered and cried, "Yes, yes, you can trust the Newport boys." A few more shots were fired, and finally the boats turned and went back to their ship. By that time, several of the officers of the flotilla had reached the beach, and John Shaw, who was standing near Commodore Perry, heard him say to one of them, "This isn't the last of it, for the poor brig is stranded. We want to try to get her off." "What is the British brig?" "I think it's the Nimrod," said the Commodore. "She has been cruising in these waters, I learned yesterday, on the lookout for any vessel trying to get into the harbor." "She is standing off," said the officer, and John looked and saw that she was. He did not hear the Commodore's answer, and presently he galloped away, after giving some directions to his men. After 2 hours, the British ship had sailed out of sight, and many men in boats rowed out to try to help get the brig off. But it was of no use. The tide was falling fast, and they knew they must wait for the flood tide before there was any possibility of getting her off. She proved to be a Swedish brig, with some name that no Yankee tongue could manage, probably, as no record was kept of it. Men watched on the beach all day to help if needed, and men from the flotilla were sent on board. But flood tide came, and the vessel did not budge an inch. Again the tide went out, and in the early morning the enemy's brig came in sight again, and stood in for the harbor. John Shaw could hardly be persuaded to go to bed that night, and was on the beach again at the very earliest streak of dawn. He ran up to one of the seamen whom he knew, and said, "Isn't the Britisher standing in?" "She is that, and fast too, and she'll knock the Swede to pieces if she ain't stopped too." Just then Commodore Perry came riding down, and saw John, and beckoned to him. "John," he said, "you run and tell your father to call out the militia, and tell him to bring the 2 12-pounders and plenty of shot. Hurry up now, you understand?" "Yes, sir," said John, and he took off his cap. "I'll do it, sir," and he went off like a deer. He burst into the old house opposite the mill like a cannonball himself. "Father, father," he shouted, "the Commodore sent me to tell you to call out the militia and to bring the 12-pounders and plenty of shot." "What?" said Mr. Shaw, as he jumped out of bed, only half awake. "Did the Commodore say that?" "Yes, he did, and he told me to hurry too, and the British brig is standing in fast." "Jerusalem," said Mr. Shaw, captain of the militia, and that meant a great deal. If the Commodore said hurry, there's need of it. He hurried so much that in half an hour the company of militia, very much mixed as to uniform it must be confessed, were on the beach with their two 12-pounders. "I thought so," cried the Commodore, when a puff of smoke came from the side of the Nimrod. "That hit too." And he sighted one of the guns and fired, but the British vessel was out of range, and the shot fell short. The officers of the Nimrod saw that the guns were of no use and fired rapidly, not only at the disabled vessel, but also at the crowd on shore. But the range was a long one, and when the shot struck the beach, their force was spent, and the boys, who collected in a large number, for every boy in town was there, ran to catch the shot as they struck. John ran with the rest, and was lucky enough to catch two balls, but one was just spent and came down on his shoulder with such force that he was knocked over. He and another boy, who was only 11 years old, and who with John helped the men to serve the guns, caught more balls than anyone else. The Nimrod fired faster and faster, with telling effect, and at last everyone on the beach gave a great groan, for the boats of the Swedish vessel were lowered, and the crew and the men from the flotilla jumped in and lifted others in, and pushed off, and at the very same moment boats were lowered from the Nimrod and were pulled toward the disabled vessel, while the ship's guns fired over their heads. The crew and the seamen reached the beach. They brought with them several men who were wounded, and they were quickly carried up into the town, and one of the seamen said sadly, "We left one of our mess dead on the deck." The boats from the Nimrod reached the ship about the same time that the crew got ashore, and their men jumped on board, but Perry's 12-pounders were able to carry as far as the stranded vessel, and he opened fire upon it, and presently the men from the Nimrod pushed off, and almost instantly a great tongue of flame burst up from the deck of the ship. The captain stood on the beach, stamping with rage and grief, and Commodore Perry went up and spoke to him, but he was so wild with his various emotions that he did not seem to understand him. But the Commodore pointed toward the northeast, and he turned and looked, and so did all the people. John looked too, and in another moment came a great cry, in which he heard his own voice, of the gunboats. Commodore Perry had sent round 2 gunboats for the stone bridge, and for some reason, John never knew they were behind time. They began to fire on the Nimrod as soon as they were in sight of her, and soon weighed anchor and stood out to sea. In the meantime, the seamen and crew and many of the men from Newport went out in boats and put out the fire on the brig, and as soon as the gunboats came back, which was very soon, as they only wished to drive the Nimrod away, all hands set to work to get the vessel off, and got her into the harbor, and the next flood tide she floated, and was brought up to the wharf. The boys who had captured the balls lugged them home with great triumph, and for years after, they were shown to their children and grandchildren as war trophies. The little boy who had shown such bravery in catching the balls was sent for a few days after by Commodore Perry, and he asked him if he would like to be a midshipman. And as he was very anxious to be one, and his family were willing, Commodore Perry gave him an appointment. He died quite young of yellow fever in some foreign port. In after years, no story of old times so delighted the children of this generation as the story of the hot balls on Newport Beach. And for many years, a cannonball lay on either side of the old-fashioned chimney, just within the jams, and little feet pushed them about, and little people wished that they too had lived in such delightful times. But the white-haired old man would say, "These are better times, when we're all at peace," and so say we all of us. This story came from the great state of Massachusetts, being reported in the Boston Weekly Globe of September 6, 1890. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.